So with that, let me introduce our speaker tonight. We're very fortunate to have with us Dr. Wyatt Rory Hume, our beloved dean. He is a clinical professor, and as I mentioned, he's dean at the University of Utah School of Dentistry. And a little bit about Dean Hume. Throughout his 4 decades as an active clinician and scholar, he led research studies that first resolved the therapeutic / toxic paradox of zinc oxide eugenol that we all used to use years ago, then demonstrated the release from the restorative materials and movement or lack of movement through dentin to the pulp at various acids, hydroxyl ion, and unreacted components of resin-based restorative materials. He is the winner of multiple teaching awards for his teaching in restorative dentistry, cariology, and pulp biology. He is co-editor and a multiple chapter author of the textbook Preservation and Restoration of Tooth Structure, now in its 3rd edition. He is a fellow of both the American Academy of Restorative Dentistry and the Academy of Dentistry International. I know Dr. Hume to not only be passionate about dentistry, but he has a couple of other passions that I'm aware of, the first of which is his family. And Dr. Hume married his childhood sweetheart, Jenny, and together they have 2 children and 3 grandchildren. His second passion that I know about is that he is an avid rower. In fact, he is a world-class competitive rower. And when pandemics are not raging, you may find him competing with his rowing crew at exotic locations around the world. With that, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our presenter tonight, our beloved dean, Dr. Rory Hume. Thank you.
Dr. Boseman, thank you very much. Folks, good evening. Great to have you with us. I'm going to go to share screen and then to a PowerPoint presentation. And I'll go to slideshow and play from start. And that should be November. Will let me know if I've messed it up, or Alicia, I think we're okay.
It's perfect, Dr. Hume.
Okay, I love this title, Preservation and Restoration of Tooth Structure, because it really describes best my interests in my focus areas of interest in dentistry. Please, as we go along, use chat for any questions, as was mentioned to you before. I probably won't monitor those myself minute by minute, but if there's anything urgent, others can break in and let me know, but I will pause a couple of times along the way to check chat and to respond to any questions. It's nice that we can connect at all in these times. I regret that we can't be together. I am a restorative dentist in history, and as Dr. Boseman said, probably for about 40 years, I was an active clinician in that field. When I became dean at UCLA about 15 years ago, I then got moved into university-wide administration, which was a wonderful thing to do. But unfortunately, at that stage, I had to stop seeing patients because my boss required my presence at all hours. So I'm not a current restorative dentist. I was a professor of restorative dentistry for a long time, but I have maintained my interest in particularly the restorative preventive interface. My wonderful dental mentor in clinical dentistry, Graham Mount, and I decided in the early 90s that we should bring together what we felt were the present trends in how to prevent and cure, because by then we believed we could cure dental caries, and restoration of teeth. So we made the book Preservation and Restoration of Tooth Structure, and I've worked on that ever since. It's in its 3rd edition now. That keeps me current with the science and the field. I don't have any conflict of interests, not even relative to the book. Not that you're likely to run out and buy it, but we've always donated all of the royalties to a research fund. So we've never taken any money from it. I'll do 3 main pieces. And the first is to focus on caries mostly and corrosion. And I'll irritate you by calling it corrosion, because that's the accurate name. later on, I'll talk about restorative modalities, but from the perspective of how they support the effective treatment and cure of caries. I won't give you a comprehensive rundown on restorative materials. That wouldn't be possible in this time. And I'll finish with some fairly brief discussion of responses to both caries and tooth restoration, why the pulp hurts and why it dies. And as Dr. Boseman just said, that was my research field in the laboratory setting for some wonderful decades. So dental caries. We make our clinical decisions based on our understanding of the disease, and it's always been that way. If we think a disease is caused by devils, we call for a priest, and if we think it's called for a virus, we try and immunize people against the virus. So we do things based on our understanding of what the disease is, and that has held very true for caries ever since caries became a pandemic for humanity, and certainly it's a pandemic now. Still is. And data on outcomes are a great way of telling us whether we've got it right. And if we don't have it right, we should change it and again, keep on treating people as well as we can. I'm going to start with two population-wide clinical trials, really preventive restorative attempts to address caries on a population-wide basis. And we learnt an enormous amount from these two trials. And they span the last 100 years. And they tell us a lot about beliefs and attitudes, both within the public and in the profession about caries. And so the first one runs from 1920 to 1970, the second one from 1970 till now. It's still running. And we learnt a lot from these two different population-wide clinical trials. Extraordinarily rare that we get this in the world. And one of the people on the call tonight is just checking into New Zealand, and we start in New Zealand. New Zealand, at the end of World War I, the chief dental officer for the New Zealand Army came back from the trenches of Europe and said that there was many more problems keeping soldiers in the field with oral health than any other health issue. Of course, there were battlefield injuries, but it was the biggest health issue was toothache, abscesses, severe pain, people becoming ill, people at risk of dying from tooth decay. And so that was the New Zealand military experience in World War I in Europe. New Zealand has provided extraordinary armies for the British Empire, sadly in one sense, but bravely in the other. He came back and said to the government, we've got a real problem in this country. And caries was the biggest problem in the country at that time in public health spending and private health spending. And he said, let's care for all of our children of school age at no cost to the individual. The family, the country was very rich because it had been selling wool to the battling armies of Europe, both sides, I think. I shouldn't say that perhaps, but it's probably true. But they had lots and lots of money. And so money wasn't the problem. They said, let's look after all of our children as best we can in 1920, which was a wonderful thing to do. And in 1920, we believed that brushing teeth after meals to remove food was the way to prevent caries. We knew about bacteria just for about 20 years, and we knew that bacteria broke down foods to make acids and that acids caused decay. And many, many people still believe this simple concept of caries. And so brush your teeth after meals to remove food was the preventive technology of the time, which was fabulous. Also, they decided to encourage all of the children to eat more fresh fruit and vegetables so that their bodies would be stronger. That was actually good advice. New Zealanders are very strong. And G.V. Black had just taught dentistry how to make fillings that were better than extractions, that fillings were an acceptable modality. And all of the wonderful principles that Black had laid out were there. And New Zealand said, wow, let's apply those principles and these preventive technologies to the whole population of children at the country. It'll be free, everybody will get it. And sadly, in one sense, because of local politics within the profession, the delivery system was dental nurses who were trained to do that preventive education, brush your teeth after meals, and to do fillings. Amalgam fillings in posteriors, silicates had just come along in anterior teeth. Science didn't advance very quickly in those decades. And for political reasons, the technologies of care became fixed. The New Zealand nurses trained each other. The next generation was trained by the previous generation, and it went on for 50 years. And that was really unfortunate for the people of New Zealand, but it was a fabulous lesson for the rest of us. So here is an early school dental nurse looking after this young man who subsequently lost all of his teeth. And here later on is a later generation New Zealand school dental nurse looking after a young lady who subsequently got a lot of dental troubles as well. The decayed missing filled numbers went up, and they kept on going up. Each child received 35 fillings by the time they were 16 on average. Most of those, of course, were replacement fillings. Many had their teeth extracted in their 20s. They gave up. 60 years later, 70% of New Zealand 60-year-olds had no teeth. And that was the world's highest rate of edentulosum. And that was a terrible outcome. So it absolutely failed to meet the expectations of the very high-minded people who applied the best knowledge of the time to a whole population. It failed. Brushing teeth after meals to remove food is not a good preventive technology for caries, even though most of our patients still believe that today. Aggressive restoration, which was in 1920 the state of the art in care, turned out to be a catastrophe. The combination of the two didn't work for a whole population. Brushing teeth after meals, caries doesn't start where the food sticks. Caries starts where the biofilm is thickest, and we'll come to that in a while. It's a biofilm disease, not a residual food disease, except in the very old who've got recession and some food stays after they eat. And we'll come back to that a little later. An aggressive restoration was the best that we could do. It was better than extracting teeth to start with, no doubt about that, but they only repair the damage. They don't fix the problem. The disease goes on, the fillings fail, they get bigger, they're replaced, and the patient eventually says, I've had it. Please take the tooth out, doctor, and that's what happens. Even Black, when you read Black's literature of the 1920s, he said, if you do these restorations really well, you can get somebody well into adulthood before you have to extract their teeth. So he didn't pretend that they were a cure-all, because they weren't. It also failed, I believe, because the dental nurses scheme was badly conceived. They were unsupervised, and the care didn't evolve. Even up to the 1950s, there wasn't much science up to the 1950s, but there wasn't even the beginnings of fluoride. And some people still see that as a great success. Public health people say, oh, it was wonderful, all the people got care. I believe it was a catastrophe. It was tried again 50 years later. And I was very fortunate to be having been born in the place, one of the first places where it was tried. And it was the state of South Australia, about the same population size as New Zealand or Utah. The whole state, a massive problem with caries. The state actually at that time in 1970 had lots of money. Sadly, it was the Vietnam War that made all that money. Oral care for children at school age at no cost to the child or the family. And it's still a logical approach. If you want to deal with caries, this is how you should approach it. Get to the children, get them healthy, let them grow through life. But by then the science was different. Even by 1970, the science was becoming different. So the approach to care was different. And I was part of this scheme. I didn't design it. I was a young dentist working in it. Clean teeth daily to remove biofilm. That's what we told people. We didn't say get the food off your teeth. We said clean your teeth with brush and floss very thoroughly, at least once a day, to get the biofilm off. Turns out to be terrific because it deals with periodontal disease very well, and it also decreases some caries. Dietary counseling. We spent thousands of hours teaching a whole community about the realities of diet and caries. Diet meaning food and drinks, sucrose and frequency, both of those things. Cane sugar, sucrose, and frequency of other fermentable carbohydrates, food and drinks. Enormous amount of education, public education, schools, community halls, families, one-on-one. Fluoride by then was available, which was fabulous, of course. As you know, that's a 60% reducer of caries. Community water supply, offered topical toothpaste, really helpful. Fissure sealants had just arrived. And so we had fissure sealants for what Black called class 1s, what we now call site 1s carious lesions, using resin-based adhesion, a fabulous technology. And most importantly, not aggressive tooth restoration, but the cautious restoration of advanced defects. And again, we only had amalgam. By then we had resin composite, which is a bit better than silicate. And in small restorations is actually quite a good material. We also used auxiliaries, but they were directly supervised. And I was one of the supervising dentists. So the care continued to evolve as the science evolved. And the great example was that by the 1980s, that scheme was doing active remineralization of early lesions, reversal of early lesions, because the science by then said, you can do this, here are the data. So it was a different approach. And this is a picture of one of the South Australian dental therapists in that early time. The outcomes were extraordinary. DMFT fell from 12 at 12 to 0.5 at 12 over 15 years. So the average 12-year-old in 1985 had half a carious lesion in a tooth, a half. So that's every two children had one, instead of each child having 12. Those who had low caries at 12 still have low caries. They're now 50 years older. My children are part of that generation. They're excellent dental patients. They care about their periodontal health. They love aesthetics. They really cared about orthodontics. They want things fixed. They want their families fixed. It was a total boon for dental practice. Instead of extracting teeth and making dentures, suddenly there was a whole population with teeth who adored dentistry. Edentulation became very rare. When I was Dean of the Sydney School about 20 years ago, we stopped teaching full dentures to predoctoral students. There just wasn't enough demand. It became a specialist function. So it was a great success. The expectations were met, and this was a valid population-wide clinical trial with hundreds of thousands of children. And so it was an extraordinary lesson for the world. Unfortunately, it wasn't well published. So why did it work? Clean teeth, brush and floss daily to remove biofilm. Great for caries to some degree, very good for perio. Dietary counseling, and this was the principal turnaround. We taught a whole population about caries as a dietary choice disease. Fluoride, fabulous. Fissure sealants, fabulous. Cautious restoration of advanced defects, very important. We said, stop being aggressive. I got abused by some older dentists for leaving caries, and I said, we're reversing those lesions. They're going away. Come back in 2 months. They won't be there, and they weren't. A few places adopted it. All of the other Australian states adopted various models of it, and some Canadian provinces, and it works very well when it's done. You have to have a strong political determination to do it. The profession initially didn't want it, and it was state politicians who wanted it. The profession joined in later because it was great for dental practice. It was expensive to start with while there was a restorative backlog. It got cheap later, but still across a whole population, it required investment and was expensive. I don't think it would work as well in populations today. It'd be much harder to have that success. Now, a lot of people buy manufactured food rather than food from raw materials. In the 70s and 80s in Australia, most families made their food from raw materials. They bought fruit and vegetables. They bought the sugar if the sugar was going to go into the food. They didn't buy prepared food that had the sugar in it already. My favorite, of course, is bread. And bread, now has sugar added to it, which is crazy. Most of the food that we buy that's manufactured has added sucrose. And if you were to attempt this, if anybody really wanted to try it, I do believe that it's great to have auxiliaries delivering, but they should be supervised by dentists. I believe they must be supervised by dentists for it to be effective. But the positive news is that the science is even better now than it was in the 70s and 80s. We know more about caries now than we did then. We've also got a few new technologies of care. Glass ionomer cement, which is a wonderful addition to our toolbox. Silver diamine fluoride, which is a great addition to our toolbox. They can help as well. So I think we can still confidently say that we can look after individuals, families, and if we wished to, communities. We know much more about appetite, biofilm, salivary biochemistry now than we did in 1970 and 1980. That science has filled in wonderfully, and I'll talk about that in the next half hour or so, because I am going to talk to you about what caries is, what our understanding is today. You know, we don't think it's caused by worms anymore. That's what we thought 200 years ago. We don't think it's caused scientifically. We don't think it's caused by food remaining on the teeth anymore. Most of our patients think that. Most of our dental students think that when they come join me, and they still say, oh, but when should I get the food off my teeth? I say, you know, when you're 70, it'll get to be important. Caries is the progressive demineralization of tooth structure, demineralization outweighing remineralization, phenomenally important concept, and John Featherstone is responsible for that, a New Zealander, bless him. A disease of bacterial origin and dietary origin. It's a bacterial disease, we were right in 1910, but it's a disease of dietary origin, not food stuck on the tooth origin, but frequency and content of diet, food and drinks, much more complicated. It's reversible. Early lesions can be turned around, and that's a really important service to our patients, and it makes a big difference to our restorative choices and actions. And it's enduringly repairable if we restore the appetite, biofilm, saliva, biochemical balance, which is what's wrong when caries happens, favoring remineralization. That is, if we cure the disease. And we now know we can cure this disease by biochemical and behavioral change. It's not simple. I wish it was simple. It's not. It's multifactorial, and it's highly variable between individuals and even between communities. We need to have a detailed understanding of the disease if we're going to tackle it properly. I'll do my best to explain it as simply as I can, but I've got to explain it is also complex. There's no single vector. There's no single cure. There's no single cause. I will start with something very familiar, and this is the Venn diagram that the US Public Health Service said that we should have because it was a chronic disease. It's actually not bad in some ways because it does summarize some of the things that cause bacteria, but it doesn't give you any indication what to do with a patient who has caries. Nothing at all. So it's accurate, and it might be useful in education in some ways, but we as professionals need to know a lot more about caries than this in order to successfully intervene with an individual, a family, or a community. After many years of thinking and talking and explaining, I believe that I can best explain caries by saying there are 5 key factors in caries. It's not simple, 5 key factors. First, it's a bacterial infection, first of biofilm, then later on of dentin. That's what it is. It's a bacterial infection. You catch it. It's absolutely dependent on dietary sucrose. The sugar industry tries to confuse us and say, no, other things cause caries. No, other things contribute to caries, but sugar starts caries. Sucrose, cane sugar, starts caries. It's rate driven. I can't give a more simple phrase than this. It's rate driven. How fast it becomes is driven by the frequency of eating or drinking any fermentable simple carbohydrates, including sucrose, but also glucose, fructose, lactose, mannose. There are a few other simple sugars in the diet. It's modified wonderfully by topical fluoride. It's not stopped by topical fluoride, but it's modified and decreased if we get it right, mostly through ion exchange post-eruption. We now understand that very well. And it's modified by salivary flow rate and composition. Sadly, wonderfully in one sense, in terms of vertebrate evolution, saliva is the wonderful thing in which to store teeth. High flow rate saliva is perfect, but for many humans, low flow rate saliva is a catastrophe. So they're the 5 key factors. I'm now going to go through them one by one, and give you the evidence in every case. Summarize the evidence, I should say. Bacterial infection, and the bacterial species is Streptococcus mutans, as I hope all of the dentists and hygienists know. It's the infectious essential, because only Streptococcus mutans changes the nature of plaque biofilm by making extracellular polyglucans. That changes the thickness of biofilm, but it also changes the biochemistry. It turns it into a gel. It's thick, it's sticky, and it's a gel. It's not a liquid anymore, it's a gel. You don't need many strep mutans. A high proportion, 3 or 5% in the biofilm is enough. Other bacterial species then join, and other bacterial species sort of travel with it, like the acid conditions, and they also make acid and survive well in the acid conditions. Once the bacteria reach the dentin after the enamel is destroyed, or if this is root surface, once they just get into the structure of teeth, a lot of other bacterial species join in and have a great time. Lactobacilli, which we thought were the major cause of caries back 100 years ago, actinomyces also, a lot of them come in, and strep mutans actually becomes quite unimportant. So strep mutans is the initiator, but it's not the major driver once it gets into dentin. Evidence: you can prevent infants from catching Streptococcus mutans. They're infected by their parents usually, their siblings often, their playmates. And people worked really hard to keep kids free of strep mutans until they were teenagers, and then they started kissing people, and then they're cooked. And that's when they start getting strep mutans. You can keep infants free of strep mutans. You have to train parents very carefully, but it can be done. Evidence: hunter-gatherers and hunter-gatherers were studied very well in the 1960s and 70s. Many of them have no caries at all because of dietary choice. They don't have sucrose in their diet. They don't have any detectable strep mutans. And of course, they have no caries. Rat studies, and you can infect rats. There's a wonderful, sad rat model of tooth decay. And unless you give rats Streptococcus mutans, you can feed them all sorts of rubbish and they don't get caries. So just to quickly summarize again, strep mutans is the infectious essential. It starts caries. It makes biofilm caries pathogenic. Once it reaches as dentin, it becomes different. Other bacterial species join in, actually hundreds of them. It's a bewildering array of bacterial species that drive caries once it gets into dentin. The important take home here is that you can delay the start of caries in children by preventing their infection. And I'll talk a little bit more about how you do that in the next factor, which is sucrose. Caries is absolutely dependent on sucrose. Absolutely dependent on sucrose, despite what the sugar industry would try and tell us. It's the only component in our diet that has the high energy bond between glucose and fructose that allows strep mutans to assemble the extracellular polysaccharides that makes the gel. There's nothing else in the diet that strep mutans can use to do that. Glucose doesn't do it, fructose doesn't do it, lactose doesn't do it. This is what makes biofilm pathogenic. It's the combination of sucrose and strep mutans. And that favors strep mutans survival. They use the extracellular polyglucans as their long-term energy source, the same way that we use fat and glycogen, but they do it extracellularly, which is quite a trick. But it changes the biochemistry of the biofilm, and that favors their survival. It's really good for them. But what it does, it traps hydrogen ion deep in the biofilm against the tooth surface. And I hope you're working out that if it traps hydrogen ion down there, it's a problem. And it excludes salivary buffers, including phosphate. And phosphate is the thing that rebuilds lost enamel or lost appetite. So it's the perfect storm. Sucrose and strep mutans together change biofilm from something that in hunter-gatherers is probably protective, protects the proteins, protect the tooth against occasional dissolution by acid foods, because that's only occasional, but it changes it to something pathogenic. Biofilm becomes bad news. Thick, excludes buffers, excludes phosphates, and it favors the survival of acid-producing organisms, traps acid against the tooth structure. So that's the thing. Evidence in humans. There was an extraordinary piece of evidence. It happened also to be in Australia in the 1960s. Hopewood House, I've been there. It's a sort of like a mecca that dentists should visit. It's in Bowral, lovely country just southeast of Sydney, an hour or two's drive down. It was a gated orphanage. The man who ran it was crazy. He didn't allow sucrose onto the premises. No sucrose came in. He really had a thing about sucrose. He didn't have a thing about toothbrushing. Most of the kids didn't brush their teeth. I've seen teeth shed, a full shed exfoliated deciduous set of 20 teeth from a child from Hopewood House. They were all green. The kid never brushed his teeth, no caries at all. No caries at all, never brushed his teeth. Doesn't sound logical, does it? But no sugar on the premises. As soon as the children, and they were studied, as soon as the children left the University of Sydney, Dean actually went and studied them. As soon as they left, went into regular society, they got caries just like everybody else. They soon caught up because they didn't brush their teeth. Anyway, they got caries then. And second piece of evidence, people with hereditary fructose intolerance, they can't have sucrose as well as fructose. Otherwise, they get very sick and they may die. They learn to avoid sucrose. They don't get caries. And then in rats, using the rat caries model, it's very simple. You can infect rats with strep mutans, and if you feed them a non-sucrose diet with lots of fermentable carbohydrates, they don't get caries. You have to initiate caries by making the biofilm pathogenic with sucrose, then any of the fermentables, and they'll get caries. Sucrose used to be really rare in the human diet. It was a trace thing that would turn up very, very occasionally, small proportion, a few fruits. We love sweet things because we crave things that have vitamin C. That's a natural survival thing. Once we started to manufacture food, in a sense, and sucrose was one of the earliest manufactured foods by the sugar cane industry, then the sugar beet industry, a whole economy built up. The slave trade was part of the whole thing of Europe's hunger for sugar. Then it became a large part of the human diet. And then caries started in young people. Caries used to be incredibly rare until the sucrose industry came along. And we haven't evolved yet to deal with that. It's been too recent. We had billions of years to evolve as vertebrates to have really strong teeth, because that's a great selective advantage for vertebrates. But we haven't evolved yet to deal with sucrose. So we have to have dentists. Third factor, and an important one, it's rate driven by the frequency of eating and drinking anything that's fermentable. Eating and or drinking. And you can get caries just by your sipping habits as well as by your eating habits, but frequency is essential. Because anytime any fermentable carbohydrate hits pathogenic biofilm, it makes acid, and the acid is trapped deep within the biofilm. The Stefan Curve, which dentists and hygienists will know, we'll see it again in a minute, happens. The pH falls fast, slow to recover, and then demineralization happens at that interface, and remineralization is outweighed. And I'll look at the dynamics of that in a few minutes. And the evidence for this accumulated really starting in the 1940s. By the 2000s, it was pretty well all in. We had a good understanding of this aspect by the early 2000s, not by the 1990s, because a key piece of information came in about 2003. This is the Stefan curve that my generation learnt about, and it was the curve of pH in saliva. When Stefan first described it in the 1940s, he was measuring pH in saliva, and that's easy to measure. You spit into a tube, you know. All of those points were after a sucrose rinse, what's the pH in saliva? Oh, look, that's bad. Hydroxyapatite dissolves at about pH 5.5, the critical pH. Saliva gets below it, you're in trouble. And at that stage, we actually did think of caries as being a saliva-tooth interface directly. We didn't think about the biofilm being in the middle. Then in the 1980s, we started to measure pH in biofilm. And this diagram I got off the internet, and it's a current diagram. This is the diagram for thinking of the 1980s, that there would be demineralization while things were below 5.5, there'd be remineralization above. And it actually wasn't a bad idea, but it wasn't accurate. Because when you actually measure the pH in biofilm, it doesn't get below 5.5. It stops at 5.5 because the enamel surface is dissolving and it's buffered by the dissolution of the apatite. And Hans Graf did wonderful telemetry with micro probes in biofilm, extraordinary research to demonstrate this. The rapid, we still call it the Stefan curve, even though it's not in saliva, this is happening in biofilm. The rapid drop, and the drop happens in 20 or 30 seconds after contact with fermentable carbohydrates. They diffuse in quickly, the microorganisms use them fast, the pH drops, and then it's slow to recover. And how slow depends on the thickness of the biofilm. It depends on the mix of bacteria in the biofilm, and it depends on the salivary conditions outside. But it's slow. It's many minutes to half an hour, even an hour. So when any fermentable carbohydrate reaches it, the pH falls rapidly within a few seconds, and then it's slow to recover. We sort of known about that for quite a while. The pH fall is stopped when the tooth starts to dissolve. We don't see the hydrogen bubbles, but they're there at the critical pH. And the demineralization is happening while it's there at the critical pH. That's the time for which demineralization is happening. The return of the biofilm to neutrality is much slower, minutes, many minutes to an hour, depends on the thickness, the microbial composition, and the saliva. So there's the demin. The demin is happening there. You see the black line, which is the pH line. Demin is happening there, but remineralization is much slower than the return of the pH to neutrality. And this is the piece that came in around the turn of the century. And it was a fabulous piece of research. So the mineral loss lags the Stefan curve substantially. And how, so the loss happens during that, I'm pointing at my own screen, sorry. The loss happens, I could do it this way, couldn't I? The loss happens here. The pH comes up there, but the loss happens like that, and then slowly it's regained over time. And that's why caries happens. The caries happens, if the remineralization happened as fast as the pH rose, we wouldn't have a problem, but we do. So demin happens as soon as the pH falls, happens quickly, and even a few minutes at the critical pH, the enamel surface will be softened a lot. You could go on there with a Knoop hardness and scratch it, and you'd scratch a channel in it. Remineralization begins only when the pH rises, and it's very, very slow, many hours after a single drop. And that was finally nailed in about 2005. Repeat pH fall delays remineralization even more. This is the depressing curve of, we used to look at just that black line and say, oh, multiple hits with fermentable carbohydrate through the day, we're acid a lot through the day. We are, that's true. But what's happening all that time is we're getting more and more demineralization, and then we've got a really steep hill to climb to get back to ground zero before the next day starts. And so that's the problem with frequent contact with fermentable carbohydrates. The more time we're at the critical pH, the more of the apatite crystals dissolve. If we're talking about the initiation in enamel, if we're talking about starting on a root surface, again, it's apatite crystals that we're losing. Toothbrushing doesn't make any difference to that. Nothing at all. You can rush in there with a toothbrush. It doesn't change a single thing, because all of that's happening in biofilm, and the biofilm is in places where the toothbrush doesn't reach. That's why class 1s happen in pits and fissures. Toothbrushes can't get in there. That's why class 2s happen beneath the contact area. The toothbrush doesn't get there. If we flossed effectively after every time we had a sip of Coke, we'd have to floss effectively after every sip. It would make a difference. Brushing after meals doesn't help, sadly. Rinsing doesn't make any difference. Swishing and getting rid of food is a nice thing to do. It makes you aesthetically more pleasing and keeps your breath fresh, but it doesn't change the pH in biofilm. Chewing something hard does. We evolved to have that. Vertebrates chew hard things all the time, and they salivate like crazy when they do. That changes the pH. The pH comes up very nicely when we chew something hard, because we swamp the area in high flow, high pH, high phosphate saliva. Remember, when the pH comes back to neutrality, doesn't mean that remineralization has happened. It doesn't. That takes hours. pH can come back in minutes, remineralization take hours. So the best way to avoid demineralization, keep the biofilm thin, keep it non-pathogenic. How do you do that? Starve it of sucrose. That's the best way to keep your biofilm thin. Decrease the amount of sucrose in your diet. And eat things that have to be chewed hard. We don't tend to do that now with manufactured foods, even home cooking. We started to get caries problems. We certainly got perio problems in Neolithic times when we started to store grain and grind it up, because we started getting soft foods for the first time. So periodontal disease started, and caries followed a little bit. When sugar came along, that's when the pandemic really happened. Avoid drinking anything fermentable, and avoid drinking things that are acid, like the cola drinks. I'm sincerely hoping that I'm not seeing any cola drinks being sipped after dinner. But the silliest thing you could do here is to have something that has sucrose in it and that itself is acid, because that will make the whole thing worse, and it does. Okay, Diamine is reversible as long as some crystals remain. That's great news. I don't have time to go into why. It's a lovely story. We don't have a really good answer. We've got some wonderful hypotheses. But as long as some crystal of enamel remains before it falls to bits, partially demineralized enamel can heal again, which is great. From saliva-sourced phosphate and calcium, and that works really well. And in dentin, you can partially reverse also. You can reprecipitate apatite among the collagen fibers, and glass ionomer cement does that, which is one of the reasons why it's a great temporary and long-term restorative. The matrix protein of dentin is collagen, and you can reprecipitate apatite in that crystal. But the key point that I want to make here, which I think is for me certainly, it made the whole Caries story make sense at last, that remineralization takes a lot more time than demineralization. Otherwise, people wouldn't get caries if they only eat 5 or 6 times a day, but they do. People who only eat or drink 5 or 6 times a day do get caries sometimes if they're low fluoride. High fluoride, it's better. And we'll get to fluoride in a second. It doesn't take long. Dreadful human clinical trial evidence for frequency. The Vipeholm study in Sweden, a mental institution, people were given a whole lot of sugar once a day or a whole lot of sugar spread out across the day. The once a day people got no caries. Those who had it spread out got rampant caries. And that was awful, but it showed it in humans. And the sad thing was that later on, people confirmed that study using rats. It should have been the rats and then no humans, but that's what it was. But it was very strong evidence. Okay, I needn't talk about any more evidence for that one, but there's plenty. Topical fluoride, fabulous. A wonderful, wonderful story. I enjoyed telling the story to the D1 class the other day here. Topical fluoride through ion exchange at the tooth surface after eruption. Took us a long time to find that, to work that out. For quite a long time, we thought it was something nutritional, but it's not. It's ion exchange after eruption at the tooth surface. And the evidence for that is really strong. If you slip about 1 in 20 fluorides in for hydroxyl ions in hydroxyapatite, the critical pH is decreased from 5.5 to 4.5. That means it's 10 times less soluble. So fluoroappetite, I'll hold this up because you might just see it up in your corner. No, there we are. There's a crystal that's a crystal of rock apatite. It's the same thing that our teeth are made of. And it's translucent crystal, actually. It's a lovely, and it comes from Utah, I'm proud to say. It's a wonderful chemical, but it becomes much less soluble if you slip in about 1 in 5 fluorides for hydroxyls. Also, there are carbonates when apatite is formed before eruption instead of some phosphates. That makes it much more soluble. And so high carbonate apatite, when it's first erupted, its critical pH is about 6, and fluoride can take that down to about 5. Get rid of the carbonate, goes down to about 4.5, makes it much more resistant to dissolution, which is a fabulous thing, and much easier to reprecipitate, which is really important. So it's a fabulous thing to do. So it's less soluble and it favors remineralization. That substitution is almost entirely topical. We could never explain before why the fluoride level all through enamel was relatively flat. I'm using my hands, forgive me. And then at the surface, it gets a whole lot higher. And we had to say, oh, the ameloblasts get to be really active in putting fluoride in just before the tooth is finished. And that was nonsense, because if you grind the surface away, the same thing happens after a couple of months. It's all substitution after eruption. It took a whole lot of very, very good chemistry, organic chemistry. Fluoride's not easy to detect or measure, but I was working in a lab where the person in the next lab was doing that at UCLA in the 1980s, which was fabulous. So it's post-eruption and it's topical and it's great. So the surface layer becomes much higher in fluoride. Even if you grind away the old surface layer, the new one will do that over a few months. And it never made sense that ameloblasts did that magic trick themselves. So topical fluoride is the way to do it. Initially, we found out about this, of course, from epidemiology with fluorosis, what happens when you have way too much fluoride. Then they discovered that in those areas, people had low caries. They had stained teeth from the excessive fluoride, but they had low caries. Wonderful in this country, the US Public Health Service and then Grand Rapids, Michigan decided to put it into water supplies, fabulous outcomes. And then the toothpaste companies worked out that it should work just as well in toothpaste, and it did. It's just as effective if you use the toothpaste. It doesn't work if the toothpaste stays in the tube, but if the toothpaste gets on the tooth every day, then it's just as effective as water fluoridation. And also we can do fabulous things in the office, which is just great. So in all children, because children are at high risk when their teeth first erupt, because they're high in carbonate and low in fluoride. So all children should get topical fluoride at home with fluoride toothpaste and in the office. And any adults who are at high risk for whatever reason, low salivary flow or bad dietary behavior or history. Last thing in the basic story of caries, salivary flow. It's modified by salivary flow rate. High is good, low is bad, and composition. And and very simply, high flow rate saliva has a lot more phosphate, which is just evolutionary fabulous. That's what we need. Extremely effective buffers, several buffer systems, and most importantly, it has lots of phosphate, and the phosphate actually pushes back the phosphate in remineralization. We evolved, all vertebrates evolved to have strong teeth. You know, all of our vertebrate ancestors had teeth, otherwise they wouldn't have survived. And the salivary phosphate and high flow rate saliva is what enabled them to have teeth. Remineralization begins once the pH comes back to neutrality. It's slower, but it continues for as long as the pH is neutral or higher, which is great. But remember, it's relatively slow. Okay, the evidence is abundant. Decreased salivary flow due to pathologies, the use of almost all drugs that change mood are a caries catastrophe. They just increase caries rates. And it's one of the reasons why teenagers shouldn't smoke pot. There's probably many other reasons too, but from a dentist point of view, that's a really strong reason. And there are very beneficial effects of increased salivary flow with chewing gum, interestingly, and wonderful clinical trials with the prescribed use of chewing gum. In high caries rate individuals, you can stop caries in its tracks. There was a really strange study done in West Africa where the only thing that kids who had rampant caries were given was chewing gum and instructions on when and how to chew it, and all of their caries stopped. Didn't change their diets. All that they did was increase their salivary flow. So that's my fast gallop through the 5 main factors. I'll hold up my hand. The 5 main factors that I believe, if you understand those factors, you can prevent and cure caries in any individual, any family, any community, if you want to do that. So I'm going to have a look at the chat box, see if there's anything there. I can't actually see the chat box on mine. Why is that? Forgive me, I'm going to stop my share for a second and then I can have a look at chat. No, nothing sitting there. That's okay. Sorry if I've overwhelmed you, but I'm going to have a tiny stretch. I'm not going to stop for long because there's other things that I'd really love to cover with you. Okay, you've had your chance. If you haven't stood up and sat down again by now, too late. Okay.
We do have one.
Oh, do we? Okay.
Yes.
Thanks, Elise.
Not a problem. Can you give a quick rundown on how to use silver diamine?
I will. And my answer is yes. Stay with me. Okay. Oh, now why isn't that? There we go. Okay. Okay, there we are stretching. Okay, and silver diamine is going to be one of the additional points that I pop in here. From here on, I'm going to do some additional stuff about caries because I think it's interesting. I think I'm pretty well on time. Then I'm going to talk about restorative modalities from the caries perspective. And then I'm going to talk about pulpal responses to caries. and restoration. I'm pleased with the timing. Thanks for that question. It's a great question, and I have a very specific answer for you in about 7 minutes. Everything I've said has been about, nearly everything I've said has been about the start of caries in enamel, because that's what we understand best. It's the easiest to study, strangely. You can really get into that biofilm. You can put microelectrodes down at the bottom. You can sample it. You can do bacterial, everything. Is it the same when it reaches dentin? Sort of. We'll talk about that in a bit of detail in a moment. Is it the same when it starts on the exposed surface of the root surface caries or cemental caries? Yes, mostly. There are some differences, but mostly. It's certainly a bacterial disease, and there are many types of bacteria involved. It's not a different disease. The bacteria are still, and it's still bacteria making acids. It's not that bacteria are eating the teeth. They don't use the teeth as their substrate. They still use fermentable carbohydrates from food or drinks as the thing that drives the disease. Thank goodness. Otherwise, we'd never be able to treat this disease. It is also driven by how often we eat or drink fermentable carbohydrates. So it's a substrate acid problem in dentin. It's much less amenable to topical fluoride, unfortunately. And that's why we've got this thing called the fluoride bomb. And I don't know if that's still a term that dentists use in conversations, that, oh, we had this patient and their enamel surfaces were terrific, but once it got through the enamel, it took off. And topical fluoride doesn't make much difference then, because the fluoride doesn't get in there to participate in remineralization. Topical fluoride works really well on the enamel surface and on the root surface, but it doesn't work in the depths of dentin. And similarly, it's probably less influenced by salivary flow, because saliva doesn't get in there in a flowing way, There's not much saliva reaches into the depths of a carious lesion. Bacteria stay there. And this is the sad news, I think, in a way, that is part of this presentation. After we removed the softened carious dentin, dentists believed, from 1947 on, we believed that if you scraped away the softened dentin with an excavator or a slowly rotating burr, all of the bacteria go. That there was a demineralized zone ahead of the zone of infection, and it's not true. There are bacteria well ahead of the demineralization, sadly. And I found that I did a little bit of electron microscopy at one stage. You can see that I wasn't very good at it. It's not a particularly well-focused shot, but those are cocci in dentinal tubules underneath a fully excavated carious lesion in a tooth that had been extracted in the dental hospital where I used to work. And then I cracked the tooth so I could look at dentin. I was doing studies on sealing dentinal tubules after acid etching, and there were all those bacteria down there. And every tooth I did had the same thing. Rella Christensen is right now doing research in Provo, Utah, demonstrating the bewildering array of bacteria that remain in dentin well beyond where we stop removing them when we're treating caries by excavation. Okay, sad news. I'll come back to that in a minute when we start talking about restorations, because we can still successfully stop caries despite those bacteria if we prevent them from getting dietary substrate, because they don't eat the host. They only live on the food that we have. Okay, root surface caries seems to have the same initiating factors as caries on enamel, caries on smooth surfaces. There are bacteria in biofilm. You can sample the biofilm. It seems to be roughly the same. A higher proportion of actinomyces maybe. It sort of gets confused with the bacterial mix that happens in biofilm that's left alone in contact with periodontal tissues. So it's hard to it's not exactly the same as coronal biofilm, but it's similar. And it's very much driven by frequency of contact with fermentable carbohydrates. So it seems to be the same sort of disease in terms of initiating factors. Here, topical fluoride is really valuable in turning it around. And salivary flow rate and composition. This is not like the depths of a carious lesion dentin. This is a surface that you can get to, particularly if you get to it reasonably early in the process. If the surface is softened, this is the great thing about cemental caries, if the surface is simply softened, not falling to bits, you can make it hard again with good salivary flow, with topical fluoride, and with dietary change the biochemistry, and that tooth can remineralize. And the dentists here probably know that this is the best treatment that you can do for cemental caries, is to make it hard again. Because if you don't, restorations will fail. And if you do, you don't need restorations. So it's very amenable to biochemical change. So very reversible with biochemical change. And that's root surface caries in a nutshell. Okay, what can we do now to prevent and cure caries? And aggressive tooth restoration is not the answer. And I hope you understand that. 100 years later, we understand this disease a whole lot better, and we can do a whole lot of things to prevent this disease and to cure it that don't involve picking up a handpiece. We use the handpiece to repair the damage, but that never prevented the disease and it never cured the disease. So all that we did in 1970, and these things I hope are familiar to all of you because we all learnt to do them. Remove the biofilm every day, do as well as you can every day, understand what the diet is and control it, be discriminating about what you eat and drink and when you eat and drink it. Topical fluoride, cleaning your teeth once a day with fluoride toothpaste is a fabulous thing to do. Fissure seals, really, really good, particularly in young people or anybody at risk. And frankly, I think that most people are potentially at risk. I think it's a good idea to seal every fissure you can find. And in the 1970s, for my children, I sealed all of their fissures, and both of them, one is nearly 50, the other one just turned 50. They're both caries free. They have been all their lives because I taught them the basics of management of caries, and fissure seals were part of that. And be conservative about your restorations. Only do restorations when they're really necessary. One of my classmates, sadly, had what were called prophylactic MOD amalgams placed on all his posterior teeth by a well-meaning dentist who said, you're going to get caries one day, so let's do the fillings while they can be small. And that was not a good service because he could have avoided those things altogether, even in the 1960s when we were dental students. In children, we can delay strep mutans infection. It's hard. It's a difficult thing to do. You have to get the parents to be low strep mutans by dietary control, fastidious hygiene, and you have to get them careful not to transmit their oral fluids to the child once the teeth erupt. Strep mutans doesn't colonize the human mouth until teeth erupt because it has to live in biofilm on a tooth surface. That's where it survives, and it has to have sucrose as well. Limit sucrose in children. Children don't need sucrose to survive. There's plenty of other ways to feed a child than giving them cane sugar. Lots of very good ways to feed a child without giving them cane sugar. And so you can delay strep mutans infection in children if you wish. A good thing to do. And control the nature of biofilm by limiting dietary sucrose. Every day when I don't have sucrose, I think, good, I'm starving my strep mutans to death today because they need this to survive. And so be very, very thoughtful about what sucrose you buy and what sucrose you use. Jerald mentioned my wonderful wife. We've been together for, gracious me, I shouldn't forget, but I think it's 53 years. And we've been married for 53 years. I still argue with her if she buys any sucrose. And I say, why is this essential for our well-being? Well, she said, because I want to preserve this fruit. And I said, yes, okay, it's toxic enough to kill the bacteria in the fruit. I don't want it to be giving you and me caries. You know, we've done very well up till now. Let's not have that in the house. I don't always win. Be very aware of salivary flow. Be very aware of salivary flow. One of the blessings of my professional life, when I came to UCSF to be chair of restorative dentistry in the early 1990s, I was invited to join a wonderful study club, which is 21 dentists west of the Rockies who are deeply interested in restorative dentistry. And they wanted somebody who was deeply interested in preventive dentistry as well. And they chose me as a restorative preventive person. And I meet with them each year when we can. We couldn't last year. And some of them do extraordinarily complex reconstructive prosthodontics. And it's catastrophic when their patients still have caries. And occasionally their patients will still have caries. And I help them sort out why, and it's always in older patients, salivary flow issues. It's always that without knowing, their salivary flow rate is decreased. And it's a destroyer, and it happened to me. I remember restoring a wonderful patient with a whole lot of excellent gold. They were really very fine gold castings, and most of them failed 5 years later because I failed to detect that the patient had poor salivary flow. And it was a great lesson for me. Increase it if you can, chewing hard things, stopping the drugs, changing the drugs, and there are a few drugs that can increase salivary flow, which is a good thing. And remineralize instead of restoring or before restoring. Early carious lesions you can turn around. We've all seen those wonderful, I used to say California board, now it's Reb, lesions that the board loves, very little caries, just enough to justify a restoration. If you really work at it, you can make them go away. And when you make them go away, that area is filled in with the most resistant hydroxyapatite to caries that you can create because you put fluoride into it. And so it becomes a plug of stopping the caries rather than running. If you're going to do population-wide health, do it in children first. Get the children healthy, they'll be healthy adults. If you can stop caries early in children or prevent it, get their enamel to fully mature before they get anything acid in their mouths, either cariogenic acid or food acid, then they will have tooth surfaces that are resistant to caries for all of their lives, unless they have a catastrophic change in lifestyle, and usually that's drugs that bring about that catastrophic change. Sometimes it's just going to college, even without the drugs, and a change in dietary behavior. Frequency of eating and drinking changes sometimes when adolescents leave home. But get the children healthy. If you get a healthy child, it's a logical approach. They will be healthy throughout life. Low caries children become low caries adults. Mature enamel is much less soluble and it can stay that way. And you can make enamel fully mature in the first year or so of life, or after eruption, I should say. Tooth in the mouth life, I should say. So low caries children become low caries adults and they'll stay that way. Can you use those strategies at later ages? Everything except avoiding strep mutans, I guess, because at later age you've probably got it. But you can still work on the biofilm. A student today said, how long would it take for me to get my strep mutans levels down if I really work on the sucrose? The answer is a couple of weeks, and you can make your plaque much less pathogenic. You can see that it will be less thick in the mornings. This will shock you perhaps, but it's the truth. I clean my teeth very fastidiously once every day, first thing in the morning, for reasons that you'll see later on. It's the best time. I really spend 5 or 7 minutes really working to get my teeth as clean as I can. Great for periodontal disease. It's worked very well up to my age now, and great for caries. It works extremely well. If I miss a day, the biofilm that grows is really thin. It's not the big fluffy stuff because I have very little sucrose. Sucrose changes the nature and it changes the amount, changes the thickness, changes the stickiness of biofilm. And the big thing in adults and the elderly to remember is salivary flow. Caries is certainly a bacterial and dietary disease, but when adults and the elderly get caries, salivary flow is the first thing you should look at. You'll use fluoride to help, but salivary flow is where you should go. Find out if the salivary flow is decreased. It's not difficult to measure. It's a pain in the neck. You have to spit into a tube. We're hoping there's more elegant technologies probably on the way. But it's not difficult to do that. You can also do it just by looking at the minor salivary glands, whether there's a bubble forming on a dried lip. In a lip surface is a quick pretty quick way of seeing whether salivary flow is reasonable. But pay attention to it and you can deal with it. I love this explanation of caries because at last it explains why caries happens where it happens. It doesn't happen where food sticks, it never did. The three places where caries starts are pits and fissures. First, site 1, Black called that class 1 because it was the most common. Just apical to the contact area in both anteriors and posteriors. And that's now called by the American Dental Association site 2. Black called it class 2, 3, and 4 because it was different. 2 and 3 were different in size. I mean, sorry, 3 and 4 were different in size and 2 was in posteriors. He made those distinctions because of the materials he was going to use to restore the defects. And the third one is right next to the gingiva where the biofilm is twice as thick. In every case, the biofilm is twice as thick where caries starts. That's why it starts there. It doesn't start there because food's there, it starts there because the biofilm is twice as thick there. And look at any set of posterior radiographs, you can see where the biofilm is thickest if you've got new carious, small carious lesions. Flossing is great in removing biofilm in site 2, just beneath the contact in anteriors and posteriors. Flossing works a charm. The sad thing is that flossing only works if you do the flossing for the patient. Educating a patient to floss doesn't work in the epidemiologic sense because most people don't actually do it. If you do it for your children, they won't get site 2 lesions. If you floss your children's contacts, or if you have parents floss their children's contacts, they won't get site 2 lesions. And that's a great thing because they're very destructive lesions. Brushing works for site 3, for black class 5, because that's where the brush actually reaches. That's why it was the rarest, or almost the rarest of the lesions in Chicago in 1920. That's why it got to be called class 5, because a lot of people did brush their teeth. They were brushing their teeth to get the food off, but they actually got the biofilm off from the available smooth surfaces. Okay, or did I go backwards? I think I did. There we go. Whoa, that's a bit of a glitch. I hope it's not permanent. Okay. Okay, there we are. It also explains caries beneath leaking restorations, what we call recurrent caries. It explains why caries happens in the large defect between the restoration and the tooth structure. That gets full of biofilm, gets full of bacteria, substrate gets in there, acid is produced, and the caries goes on. We call it recurrent caries. I think it would be more accurate to call it continuing caries because the bacteria do remain. And so when we get access to substrate, caries will continue despite the restoration. It's really continuing caries. And I said this was sad news, but millions of bacteria remain after we do our fastidious scraping of the dentin. If they get carbohydrate substrate, the caries keeps on going. If we can make a restoration that the restoration plus the pellicle component of the initial precipitation of biofilm, if that can seal the interface between the restoration and the tooth, the caries will stop. And in some cases that happens. Restorative dentistry can be very successful. Young children structurally at risk of caries? Yes, they are, because when the teeth first erupt, the enamel is not mature. It's got high carbonate and it's got low fluoride because it was formed in extracellular fluid. It wasn't formed in saliva. Then once it gets out, the saliva starts to do its magic and it becomes less soluble. Topical fluoride accelerates that maturation, and so do cycles of demineralization and remineralization if there's plenty of phosphate from saliva and if there's plenty of fluoride from water and food, or in hunter-gatherers from the dirt that they're eating their food ground up with, lots of fluoride in the Earth's surface. Resin fissure seals, wonderful. The outcomes are fabulous. The clinical trials data on fissure seals are extraordinary. They're like 95% effective in stopping site 1 lesions when everything else is left the same. GIC fissure seals work well too. They work well if the surface is wet. Resin fissure seals The surface has to be really fastidiously dry, and sometimes that's hard in a child. The outcomes aren't quite as good with GIC, but if it's the best thing you can do, it's better to do that than nothing. And the small resin restorations, which Richard Simonson, who first described them, called preventive resin restorations, the very small area of caries in a fissure, and you just debride that area. You don't clean out the rest of the fissure system, which Black told us we all had to do, and we did with amalgam. We had to do that. They work extremely well too. The outcomes data are extraordinary. Small resin restorations are really good. It's a very good technology for restoring teeth and stopping caries. Now, this I hope is getting to be a little repetitive and obvious. Why are some people old, some people at increased risk? Decreased salivary flow in many cases. Changes in dietary choice. Old people get bored or they get poor and they change their dietary choices. Sometimes they have less manual dexterity and therefore they can't manage their biofilm well. And even, and I think I'll say this a little later, sometimes food sticks around in areas of gingival recession, and that can be an additional problem. So effective and enduring cure requires diagnosis and then intervention. So you've got to really look at what's going on and then you can help them. Fluoride is fabulous as an aid to caries management. It has been now for 50 years and it's been 70 years now. It's been extraordinary. Water, fluoride, toothpaste water, tablets, liquids. Tablets, if you chew them, are much better than if you swallow them. It's not a nutritional thing. It never was. It's a topical thing. We didn't know that to start with. And I remember in the 1950s and 60s, advice to swallow the fluoride tablets for nutritional reasons. Doesn't work. Chew them for topical reasons works well. Liquids, varnishes, gels, strips, all lovely adhesive strips with fluoride now available. Tooth mousse, this wonderful thing about casein phosphopeptide, that does help, helps remineralize, and that's been put in some active treatments for caries. Xylitol containing gum, the clinical trials show that the xylitol containing gum works better than non-xylitol gum, probably because of calcium binding and precipitation. And then silver diamine fluoride, thank you for your question. And silver diamine fluoride is interesting. I won't talk about it for a long time, but it is a lovely sort of new technology. When you put silver diamine fluoride on a carious lesion to which you can gain access, it slows its progression for a couple of years. And in some cases, in very young people and very old people, that's a great help. So children and the elderly, if you want to avoid definitive restoration, if it's too young for a child to be exposed to having to do a restoration, you can stop the caries or slow it right down. And it's a simpler formulation of something that was around in the 1980s, which was sodium fluoride followed by silver nitrate. And there were wonderful clinical trials done on that in the 1980s. And then people worked out, hold it, we can do this in one hit. And a lovely clinical trial, one of many that I read and thought, okay, this will be useful in this lecture. You with 12% or 38% silver diamine fluoride applied once or twice a year, it stopped caries in the following rates. 53% were arrested. That is, they were hard on probing, with 12% with only once a year, 59% went twice a year, so pretty effective. With 38%, the higher concentration, 65% arrested once a year, 76% when applied twice. And those were all valid, the numbers were large. It's most effective on the smooth surfaces of anterior teeth, but it works on posterior teeth as well. And so they recommend application twice a year until you can do something else. Okay, so that's my very quick silver diamine fluoride. It works well. It's not, it doesn't stop the disease absolutely, but it slows it down very significantly in a number of cases. Rella Christensen has shown that it doesn't kill the bacteria deep within the lesion. They just continue happily unabated, but it does seem to create a hard enough surface layer with enough reprecipitated fluoroappetite that it slows down access of substrate and the lesion slows down. It doesn't sterilize, it doesn't cure, it slows it down. And that's, I think, that's worth doing. Okay, I am a glass ionomer cement enthusiast, I guess. For me, it's a new material because it was relatively new in my professional life. We didn't have glass ionomer really functionally until the 1980s. It wasn't a very good material to start with. Sadly, in one way, it was developed by the British government chemist to try and get a material that would be better than resin-based composite for treatment of caries in the British National Health Service. It was certainly better than silicate cement, which was one of its predecessors, and it wasn't as good initially as resin-based composite in most applications. But the promising thing about it is that it adheres chemically to wet tissue. So it adheres chemically to dentin, which is wet. So it adheres both to enamel and to dentin. It doesn't leak. It doesn't shrink much on cure. And if there is a break anywhere, it's just into the glass ionomer. So it leaves a glass ionomer seal layer, and it does act as a fluoride reservoir. So it's an attractive material. And so it's got better and better. It was licensed by the British government chemist. That was a pity in a way, because only 2 companies took up the license. It was Espe in Europe, in Germany, and GC in Japan. None of the American companies licensed it, and so none of them wanted to market it particularly. But then both companies improved it and improved it and improved it. And it became, in my view, a very valuable addition. And our students here, I'm pleased to say, learn about and how to use glass ionomer cement as one of the things that they do. Sorry, I'm touching the wrong thing here. So that gives us a great set of options. And the options I'll go through in a little while: a cast gold dental amalgam, resin-based composite if it's small particularly, glass ionomer cement, and now we've got the wonderful porcelains, which are a great set. I believe deeply that you can cure caries in individuals. People who have caries, their caries can stop. I told you a little bit of personal stuff at the beginning, how I, as a young dentist, worked in that scheme where we reduced the DMFT in a whole population by 25 times. We took it from 12 at 12 to 0.5 at 12. We did that in 15 years. I left the scheme to start teaching before those 15 years was up, but I kept following the outcomes. We cured caries in a whole population. And certainly, you know, as an individual, I grew up as a child in the Australian countryside. I was expected to have my teeth out when I was 20 and have dentures. That was my future. I was very lucky not to go there. And by the time I'd finished dental school, I realized I could cure my own caries, because I had caries until then, and then I stopped it. And most dentists do stop their own caries. We know enough about it to stop our own. We can cure it in other people as well through the 5 factors. I believe those 5 factors can guide you to the cure in every case. Okay, the next topic, corrosion. And this is irritating for most dental audiences. Even in my native Australia, when I talk about corrosion, they don't like it because people call it erosion. It's not erosion. I grew up on a farm. I know what erosion is. This is corrosion. This is something caused by acid. And if we called it corrosion, we would more quickly understand what's going on. It's acid corrosion, the softening of the tooth surface by acid, and then loss of that softened surface by wear. And there's a lot of things that can wear it away. Even the tongue can wear it away, as dentists know from people who throw up all the time. It's not washing away, it's softening and then wearing away. Demineralization and remineralization times were studied in direct acid attack onto tooth surfaces. And we then applied that to our understanding of caries. Several microns of surface enamel become soft in a few seconds with most acid. Even citric acid, orange juice, will soften the surface in a few seconds. And hardening takes many hours. And it can take up to a full day, depending on if we don't have much salivary flow and pH and phosphate, calcium binding in the biofilm. I should say fluoride as well. I'll add that because it's a true factor. And it's the same very quick demineralization, slow remineralization with extrinsic acid, not acid from bacteria, but acid either from the gut or from food. And it can happen anywhere on smooth surfaces. It's not in the places where biofilm is. In fact, it doesn't happen where biofilm is, because biofilm protects. A loss of structure follows when mild load is applied, the crystals break down. And the sad thing is that the abrasive in toothpaste, which is great for taking off biofilm, is harder than softened enamel. So regular toothpaste applied to softened enamel will wear it away. So brushing your teeth after orange juice is not a good plan, or after wine, or after coffee, or after Coca-Cola. And so if you're going to brush your teeth thoroughly, it's best to do it first thing in the morning. Simple piece of good advice. Okay, demineralization, a few seconds. Even citric. Citric is really good at demineralizing, and that's what's in orange juice. Remineralization takes many hours, up to a day. Low salivary flow makes it slower. This is a key point in symptomatology. When dentin is exposed, the softening plus dentifrice overcomes the natural closure of the tubules in exposed dentin. All vertebrates have had exposed dentin from time to time for billions of years, and saliva can close that up. The pellicle precipitates, and then calcium phosphate, the apatite, precipitates in the pellicle, and you close the tubule and the tooth doesn't hurt. That's natural. But if you open it up every day, you get hypersensitivity. And that's the whole story of cervical abrasion hypersensitivity, because we have acid and then we brush. And if you change that sequence, it stops. Remember, toothpaste is softer than regular dentin, but it's harder than softened dentin, and so it opens up the tubules again. So all you have to do to stop hypersensitivity is say, brush your teeth first thing in the morning before you have breakfast, and then you won't get hypersensitivity. Not good news for Sensodyne. They actually want people to keep on having hypersensitivity because they sell their stuff. Cervical abrasion lesions, knot-shaped lesions, are actually corrosion lesions. They're now endemic in our population. Many, many people have them because of the common daily use of acid drinks, orange juice, cola drinks, coffee and wine, followed by toothbrushing. If you do your toothbrushing before you have those things, the knot-shaped lesions don't happen. And fortunately, one of my great colleagues ran a high caries and high corrosion clinic in the city where I was working at the time. And that was a city with a wine growing area nearby. Wine tasters have enormous trouble with losing tooth structure because they're putting wine into their mouths and spitting it out all day. And any time they brush their teeth during the day, they would wear tooth away. And he fixed that problem in wine tasters by saying, only brush your teeth first thing in the morning. So, but people don't believe you, and they're not going to do what you say anyway. Selling desensitizers is very good for business. Restoration is simple, actually, with these knot-shaped lesions, but if you don't treat the disease, they'll fail. And you've probably all seen resin-based attempts at restoration of knot-shaped lesions with the tooth wearing away around them. And here's the classic example in a sliced tooth of that wonderful knot-shaped lesion that we all now know so well. Okay, it's a clear sign of active corrosion, and it's simply treated by changing the timing. And acid-accelerated wear elsewhere happens also with people who drink a lot of acid or who have frequent throwing up, either bulimics or people who have gastroesophageal reflux disease, and will get other acid-accelerated wear elsewhere. This is out of the book that I'm editor of, came from a couple of our authors. And this is a young man, I think of about, he's 25. So look at what's happened to his teeth from cola drinks and caffeine drinks. There's caries there, obviously, from the sucrose, but there's also simple corrosion and wearing away of tooth structure. This person was an airline pilot who liked to suck lemons. I don't quite know why you'd like to suck lemons, but that's what he did. And that's accelerated wear after acid softening. Okay, quickly, and I'm not an expert on abfraction. one of my colleagues at UCSF is one of the world's experts on abfraction. Dish-shaped cervical lesions, not shaped, but dish-shaped, most probably related to tooth flexure under load. The difference is they're disc-shaped, they're scooped out rather than sharply delineated. Hunter-gatherers don't get them no matter how hard they chew and grind their teeth away, and they grind their teeth away a lot. Doesn't happen. And it's probably made worse by surface softening and then flexure. And to me, that's the most reasonable hypothesis at the moment. And you can restore these very well with glass ionomer. And I think my next slide is a lovely picture of that from my mentor, Graham Mount, that's where he really learned how to use glass ionomer. And he published a book, which is a manual of how to use glass ionomer. Okay, another tiny break, and we are 3/4 of the way through, and we're right at 3/4 time. So any questions that came in, I'm happy to address. November, any questions? Alicia?
Yeah, we do have a fair amount of questions.
Oh.
So the first one we have, what's your take on community water fluoridation?
It's still a fabulous thing to do because a lot of people don't clean their teeth every day. And community water fluoridation works very well then. And we know from fabulous epidemiologic studies that it's very effective, cost effective in terms of reducing disease burden and therefore cost to a community. And there's no adverse effects on any other part of human health. So it's a really good thing to do. It's not necessary if everybody cleaned their teeth with fluoride toothpaste every day. And it wouldn't be necessary if we were hunter-gatherers still, because we'd be getting a lot of fluoride in other ways. But it's just a really good thing to do. Capsule answer.
All right, the next question, are there additive effects of water fluoride, toothpaste fluoride, and varnish fluoride?
No, you get to a maximum, and the data show that if people put topical fluoride at toothpaste levels on their teeth every day, you get to maximum effect in about 6 months. If somebody's in trouble, yes, it's really worth doing it. In children, it's really worth doing office topical. You don't need community and fluoride and toothpaste, but a lot of people don't use toothpaste.
Okay, next, is there a type of sugar-free gum that's better than others?
No, I don't. Well, those that contain xylitol, yes. No brands, no. Anything with xylitol, the data show is better than non-xylitol gum. I shouldn't say this. Sometimes I avoid saying this in this lecture sequence, but actually even gum with sugar, if you chew it really hard, doesn't cause caries because the salivary flow rate overwhelms. But we wouldn't advise that to patients. It's better to say sugar-free, and it's better still to say xylitol.
Okay, Dr. Hume, can you discuss gender prevalence and whether puberty can start a cascade of events that set the stage for future caries?
I don't think there's any puberty difference. It's a behavioral choice disease. I don't think there's anything about male-female chromosomes or even hormonal differences that influence caries. Caries is a bacterial disease of dietary choice where demineralization outweighs remineralization. Fluoride makes a difference. Salivary flow makes a difference. I'm not aware of any changes in salivary flow in puberty. I saw Dr. Halpin on the call, and maybe if she wants to think about this one and could put something in chat, that'd be helpful. I'm not aware of anything of that kind. There's overwhelming behavioral drives in this disease. It's a disease of choice of diet, frequency, content, fluoride influencing, salivary flow influencing, but I don't think it's other host factors. I would throw in another question there. All of my family has chalky teeth, people will say. Yes, probably all of your family never really matured their enamel properly because they got an acid environment right from early years. Fortunately, nature gives us all pretty basically the same crystal structure and enamel structure to begin with. Chalky teeth are not a genetic thing as far as anybody can determine. It's an environmental thing.
Okay.
That was a bonus answer to a question that wasn't asked. How about that?
We do have a few more. Someone was asking if they could get a copy of the PowerPoint presentation.
They certainly can.
Okay. Yeah, if you send that to me, I can get that out. And then this is a long one, but bear with me. In 2016, the AAPD published a paper endorsed by the ADA, which states the sealant guideline, panel recommendations, the use of sealants compared with non-use in primary and permanent molars with both sound occlusal surfaces and non-cavitated occlusal carious lesions in children and adolescents. Do you recommend simply sealing over non-cavitated carious lesions? Are non-cavitated carious lesions arrested the same as incipient lesions as the AAPD seems to suggest?
Yeah, that's a difficult one, and I don't actually want to take a position on that. Experimentally, when people did really fastidious sealing over caries, it stopped. But it's really difficult to get an effective seal over caries. If caries is, to me, this is more a clinician's answer than a researcher's answer. If caries is physically evident, it's better to debride it and place filled resin in that area and seal the rest. I think that's better dentistry because the outcomes of that are very good. And it doesn't take long, and it shouldn't add to the expense of the exercise. You know, it's a tiny little piece of filled resin. So I think that can be done. It is, there were studies done in the, I guess it was about 2010, where people really worked hard to just seal in caries, and it stops if you can effectively seal. So I'm not dodging answering that question, and I don't want to take a position on a recommendation from a professional organization. You shouldn't worry if you think there might possibly be a little carious area and you seal effectively, it'll be okay. Okay.
Okay, we have three more.
Oh, wow.
What are your thoughts on the often seen occlusal wear of the cusps on the mandibular 6-year molars? I see these quite often and have a theory.
Oh, well, I don't see it often and I don't have a theory. So please put the theory in chat, and if we have time at the end, we'll have a look. Okay, thank you. Or contact me. I'd love to talk about it. Yes, I don't know what age you're talking about, but let's take that one offline.
Okay. What about warm water rinsing of the mouth after a citrusy drink event and waiting a while and then brushing your teeth, say maybe an hour later?
Yeah, an hour later might not be enough. You know, and the water rinse won't make much difference. It's better to chew some gum because that increases salivary flow. Yeah, the water rinse won't make any difference. You know, it'll get rid of the residual acid, but that'll be fizzing away anyway, so that'll go soon. Don't drink that stuff. You know, that's my best advice is, why would you want to drink that stuff? You know. Anyway, go on.
Okay, finally, we have something from Dr. Halpern. Dr. Hume, I wonder if hormones can affect salivary flow, autoimmune diseases, and xerostomia. Sorry.
Xerostomia, yep. Yeah, I was going to ask Dr. Halpern that because I don't know. I don't know, and it's a great question, and I don't know that answer. I wish I did. I'd love to have an answer for everything, but I don't know about hormonal changes in salivary flow. I know about drugs and salivary flow, but I don't know about hormonal changes. Okay, I would like to go on with some other stuff that I hope is of interest to you. It'll be fairly fast. And I think we'll have time, Dr. Boseman, for me to finish with a few minutes to spare. If I'm fairly quick, and I thought I was 75% done, it might be a little bit more. Some just very, very fast things about restorative materials. And I use these mostly to illustrate my main point that curing the disease is independent of the restorative materials that you use. Temporary restorations, and as Dr. Boseman said, I did research back when dentists used to use zinc oxide eugenol a lot on its local pharmacology, and it was fascinating. But I'm going to talk quickly about these other technologies. I made a mistake when I was putting this together, and the next one is going to go in the middle there, and it should go in the middle there, and it's glass ionomer cement. And then porcelain fused to metal, which I still think is a great restorative technology. And then our indirect ceramics, which are new. Principally from the caries treatment point of view. Don't expect a comprehensive review. That would take a day and not a quarter of an hour. ZOE is still really good dentistry. It's the best thing that came out of the Vietnam War. Was the American Army required or requested a long-term temporary dressing, and ZOE was that thing. It's a resin reinforced zinc oxide eugenol, IRM being the classic material. It's really worth remembering, and it's really worth using. And it's sad that dentists don't use it still, because it's a great way of stopping carious lesions in their tracks and allowing some remineralization to happen, getting things under control and getting the pulp safe before you restore. People stopped using it because they thought it would stop subsequent bonding. That's easy to deal with. You just rinse the eugenol away. It's a very effective antibacterial seal, and not really a physical seal, but anywhere that gets wet around it gets swamped with eugenol, which is a terrific antibacterial. So it kills the bacteria really well. And it gives an enduring permeation of both the carious lesion and the carious dentin with enough eugenol to kill bacteria, but not to kill the pulp, which is fabulous. It's an extraordinarily lucky piece of pharmacology. And it allows the pulp to recover from any chronic inflammation that's going on before you restore. So at one stage in dentistry, most dentists used to put a temporary zinc oxide eugenol in and wait for a few weeks before they did a filling. And it was really good dentistry. Took more time, but it had a great outcome. Glass ionomer cement can also be an excellent temporary dressing. Particularly, I have no interest at all in the GC company, but their Fuji 9 is really hard and is a great temporary restoration. And using that as a temporary before you definitively restore is good dentistry as well. Also a very good, truly antibacterial seal for physical reasons this time, because it bonds really well to enamel and dentin. It contributes actively to the remineralization in dentin, and it allows the pulp to recover. A wonderful PhD thesis was done by a young man under my partial supervision, where he showed how much strontium from glass ionomer cement as a marker of calcium goes into both carious dentin and other dentin when you use glass ionomer as a temporary restoration. Cast gold is still a fabulous restorative technology. It's the best we've ever had. If it's superbly done, it gives us the best outcomes before, particularly if you cure the caries biochemically, either at the time or just after placement. And I say just after. One of my great colleagues, when I was at UCSF, taught me how to do really, really good soft gold castings. And I said, what do you do about the patient and caries? He said, they've paid me so much, they're going to listen to me and they're going to cure the caries because they don't want these restorations to fail. And so either before or just after. Zinc phosphate, strangely, even though it's not a great material on its own, works very well as a luting agent between cast gold and the tooth. If you do it really well, you seal the interface between restoration and tooth really well. Glass ionomer cement's even better in theory, but nobody has yet done clinical trials on glass ionomer relative to zinc phosphate in gold, because they all last so long you can never find any difference. The study club that I'm in had, before he died recently, a wonderful man, Richard Tucker, and he had, his practice would only place gold in posterior teeth. Actually, that's not strictly true, but he replaced a lot of composite resin with gold in posterior teeth. Now, people might say that's unesthetic. And you know, the dentists will look at that and say, gee, that's lovely dentistry. And you might say, oh, that's not very aesthetic. That's actually what it looks like. And that's quite aesthetic. You can't see that gold. It was actually his son who's taken over his practice, gave me this slide sequence of his. Two lovely gold inlays at 2 years, the same inlays at 20 years, the same inlays at 30 years. I love that sequence because next to them is an amalgam that he did as well. And at 2 years, it looks pretty good. At 20 years, it still looks pretty good. At 30 years, it's starting to say, yes, we'll replace that one pretty soon. An amalgam is a superb restorative technique as well, if it's well done. And the recent amalgams that were developed mostly by the US taxpayer through the National Institutes of Health, the high copper, low gamma 2 amalgams that were developed in the 1970s and 80s are really fabulous restorative materials. And my mentor, Graham Mount, if you want to have a quick look at that, you'll see that that's got a ditch retention down in the gingival rather than buccal and lingual retention, for those of you who are interested in retentive form. 16 years after placement, that's what it looks like. Amalgam is a lovely material if you cure the caries. These are Graham mounts as well from our book. Pretty soon after placement, 8 years after placement, 15 years after placement, aesthetically not so good. And patients will say, I don't particularly like the appearance of that, but that's a very enduring restoration. My wife has restorations done by Graham Mount, my mentor, that were done 60 years ago that are still there. Amalgam restorations, because she and I cured her caries, and he did wonderful restorative dentistry for her. Glass ionomer is terrific. I talked about it before. You've got to control the surface moisture until it sets if you're using pure glass ionomer without the resin. That one gives us the best fluoride release and also the best enduring adhesion. It's really good. People who are xerostomics, it's a problem. And unfortunately, that's the one contraindication to using glass ionomer cement in the class 5 situation. Resins hold their structure better, but they fail because of caries. GICs, their surface degrades, but the caries doesn't happen. And again, this is from Graham Mount. This is the distal of a first permanent molar. And he was experimenting at this stage with tunnel preparations, trying to leave the marginal ridge intact. And that's what it looks like with glass ionomer straight away. And that's 12 years later. And so, and that's just pure chemical glass ionomer. The surface is fine in a normal patient. You can see that that patient has good salivary flow. And that's that. I showed you that before. That's his class 5. Resin bonded composite. From the caries point of view, resin bonded to enamel is excellent. Small cavities, absolutely superb outcomes, fabulous data, really good. Preventive resin restorations, superb restorative dentistry. It gets harder in medium-sized cavities. It's very hard to do well, but you can get good outcomes. With large cavities, it gets very difficult to do well. And the failure rate of large posterior resins is about 8 years, a half-life of about 8 years. The half-life of Richard Tucker's gold castings is 135 years. The half-life of large posterior composites is about 8. Now, not many people live to be 135, but not many people of those restorations fail. That's how you get the half-life. All of the resins shrink when they're curing. They tend to leak the bigger they are. And this is Joel Janis, one of our wonderful faculty members, Associate Professor Joel Janis. He uses this in his teaching. This is a preventive resin restoration, a small area of caries. He's taking out the rest of the fissure, which is fine. It's a very small restoration, and it's a very good one. Now, other people know a lot more about this than I do. And those of you who are faculty members here, we've got a wonderful faculty member, Mark Taylor, who knows a lot more about this technology than I ever will. It's really appealing technically. It's fabulous, I believe, aesthetically terrific. The problem is the durability of the interface between this material and dentin. And these castings can fall off. Glass ionomer cement would be a much better loot than resin, in my view, but I haven't seen any clinical trials done on that yet. Porcelain fused to metal is still a fabulous technology. And some of my happiest, I've restored patients in cast gold, and that's great. If aesthetics is really important, porcelain fused to metal works really well. Okay, this is going to be a 5-minute gallop through pulpal inflammation and death, a few very quick points. And it breaks my heart because I love this topic, but I knew I wouldn't have much time by now. Pulpal inflammation and pulp death related to caries, it's very understandable. Bacteria make exotoxins, the same thing that causes problems with periodontal tissue. If you leave bacteria undisturbed in biofilm, you get inflammation in the tissues adjacent, and eventually you get destructive inflammation and you get tissue death, and you get loss of periodontal ligament, and you get a pocket. The same thing with bacteria in caries. The toxins diffuse through the dentin, you get chronic inflammation in the pulp, then later on you get a chronic inflammation without symptoms, later on you get acute inflammation, you get partial pulp death, then you start to get some symptoms, then the bacteria invade, and then the pulp dies. That's an understandable natural sequence of an untreated carious lesion. In restored teeth, in the absence of evident caries, it's harder to explain why the pulp dies. And sometimes the pulp dies months after you fill teeth. Sometimes the pulp dies years after the teeth are filled without evident caries. And we've had three theories over the last century. The first one was thermal shock. The second one was chemical toxicity. The third one was bacterial microleakage. And I'll summarize them for you in less than a minute each. There's no evidence of thermal shock damaging the pulp. When people finally got thermocouples and put them at the bottom of fillings, they go up and down about 0.5 degree Celsius between coffee and ice cream. So it was a ludicrous thing to say that it would kill anything. If you have pulpal inflammation, it hurts. Even that amount of temperature change will move the fluid in dentin, and so it hurts. So there's no evidence that this happens. Some dentists still believe this theory 100 years later. It's fascinating to read the literature of 100 years ago. The quickest story is if you are trying in a gold inlay and it gets stuck and you can't get it out and you leave it there, you get pulpal inflammation. If you then do get it out and put zinc phosphate cement on it and re-cement it, the inflammation goes away. That showed that 100 microns of zinc phosphate was a fabulous insulator. It's not. It just actually showed that you had bacterial microleakage. Anyway, no evidence. Chemical toxicity, and Dr. Boseman mentioned that this was my research area in one sense. Strong acids don't diffuse through dentin. And if I'm to be reviled for anything or remembered for anything, it was my lab that showed that back in about 1985. We showed that you could put acids onto dentin and therefore you could start trying to bond to dentin because of hydroxyapatite buffers the strong acids. But it does increase permeability. It opens up, takes away the smear layer, opens up the tubules. There was a crazy experiment, not a crazy, people tried to determine whether acid would damage the pulp. They put acid on some teeth, they didn't put it on the others. They put zinc oxide eugenol, and on the ones that had the acid, the pulp became inflamed and died. It wasn't the acid, it was the eugenol, because the tubules had been opened. That's a very fast explanation of a serious error that was made. And that's one of the reasons why dentists avoided using acids onto dentin for a long time. But it increases the permeability to other things. And one of the things that it increases the permeability to is the unreacted monomers in resins. HEMA, which is the principal thing used in dentin priming because it's water tolerant, and TEGMA, which is the principal diluent that makes bis-GMA runny enough to use, aren't reacted fully, and they flow through the tubules to the pulp. They kill odontoblasts, and you get transient inflammation for a day or two, acute inflammation for a day or two. Usually pulps recover well. So chemical toxicity does happen. If you remove the smear layer, even zinc oxide eugenol becomes toxic. If you force, with a really well-fitting crown, if you force low viscosity resin down into the tubules and the pulp, then chemicals can kill the pulp. So it can happen, it's not common. The commonest cause of death in restored teeth is bacterial microleakage. And that's because we don't have a good seal between the filling and the tooth. The microflora are variable. And there was a wonderful PhD done by a man called Ward Massey who showed that the bacteria vary and the pulpal response varies. It's like periodontal disease. You can be unlucky or you can be lucky in the bacteria that get between your filling, your leaky filling, and the tooth. So some leaky fillings don't kill the pulp, some do. And that's because the bacteria vary. Acute symptoms only happen when pulp death is about to happen. Chronic inflammation doesn't have symptoms. Martin Brandstrom did this wonderful work, and his data show very clearly that you don't have pulpal inflammation in all cases where you have bacteria. In fact, only in about 1/3 of them do you have pulpal inflammation. That's because sometimes the bacteria are benign and sometimes they're pathogenic. It's very understandable. So the three most common causes are continuing caries beneath existing restoration. Even without enough substrate for the caries to continue, sometimes the bacteria can make a substrate enough to damage the pulp, and then advancing caries in initial lesions will kill the pulp. We know, of course, that you can kill the pulp in other ways, direct physical trauma. I think two more things in the next minute. Pulp exposure in young people, anterior teeth, we have very good prospects of success. Calcium hydroxide cauterizes the surface of the pulp, kills some local cells, but the pulp can survive. Mineral trioxide aggregate will do the same thing. As long as we have a good seal, keep bacteria out, it will work. And it works because the pulp is tough if there are no bacteria involved. Caries exposure in a young person, sometimes the pulp can survive. In particularly rapidly advancing carious lesions, lactobacilli become the most dominant form, and they're not particularly pathogenic. They make a lot of acid, but they don't damage the pulp, and so the pulp can sometimes survive. But slow growing lesions in older people, more often the pulp will die because you get a pathogenic mix of microorganisms. And so, okay, avoiding carious exposure. The old approach was to do incomplete debridement and place a temporary filling. I think it's still a good thing to do. The modern approach is to do incomplete debridement and put glass on them, a cement on them, then put your filling on, and that's probably okay too now. The clinical trials data on that are quite reasonable, actually. So both work quite well. And both are probably better than root canal therapy. Root canal therapy has good outcomes, but it's expensive and difficult to do. Okay, Jerald, I promised I'd finish before the hour. If there's any other questions that came in November, happy to do them, and then I'll hand back to Dr. Boseman. Or Alicia, sorry, you're handling the questions.
No worries. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat at this time.
Okay. I'd love to have been able to answer that question about hormonal change in salivary flow. I will give myself, Dr. Halpin and I will get together and see if we can answer that question. Thank you, folks. I hope that was useful for you. As you can tell, I'm slightly passionate about that topic. I do believe as a profession we can do better in the cure of caries than we try at the moment. At the moment, we still tend to pick up the handpiece, and I think we can do better than that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hume. I would say that you've answered many questions for most or all of us with your presentation. Thank you for that very important foundational presentation that we received tonight.